Psychologists study things like happiness, intelligence, anxiety, things that are essential to the human experience, but nonetheless are abstract concepts that don't have any tangible properties. We call these abstract ideas constructs, but the question is, how do we turn constructs into something measurable? In psychology, we call this process operationalising. How we operationalise a construct determines what we're actually studying. For example, if we operationalise stress as feeling overwhelmed, then we're studying its emotional element. If we operationalise stress as physical tension, then we're studying its physiological element. Each way of operationalising stress shapes the kind of evidence we will collect and the kind of conclusions that we can draw. Once we've decided what our constructs mean in measurable terms, i.e. operationalise them, then we have to capture them. And in psychology, different questions require different approaches to measurement. Sometimes the most direct way to study the mind is simply to ask. Self-report measures such as questionnaires or rating scales turn subjective experience into data. They're really useful for capturing a person's experience of things like their mood, their level of motivation, or their perceived self-confidence. The main strength of self-reports is that they give us information that only the individual concerned can really provide. But because of this, they're heavily dependent on things like honesty and self-awareness. For example, if you were studying happiness, a question you might ask someone is, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being extremely unhappy and 10 being extremely happy, how do you feel at this present moment? Someone might report a 10 on the happiness scale because they just want to appear positive, or maybe because they don't know how to judge their feelings. That's why psychologists have to design self-report based questionnaires very carefully, ensure that participants understand that their responses are anonymous, and also, where possible, compare self-report data to other forms of data. Other times, psychologists watch what people actually do. Behavioural measures record actions under controlled conditions, such as how long it takes someone to react, how long they persist at a task for, and what decisions they make. The strength of behavioural measures is their objectivity. They're based on observable performance, not self-report. But they can be sensitive to variations in procedural details. Even small changes in the instructions given to a participant or the conditions of the study can have a significant effect on results. That's why carefully standardising and documenting every procedural step in a study involving a behavioural measure is so important. Sometimes researchers go beneath the behaviour to examine the body itself. Physiological measures record the physical responses that accompany psychological states, using things like heart rate, cortisol levels, and patterns of brain activity. For example, if you were conducting a study that involved exposing participants to a stressful event, such as giving a talk, an increase in their heart rate and elevated stress hormone levels would indicate that your manipulation had been successful. The strength of physiological measures is that they can give you an insight into someone's psychological state without the issues associated with self-report. But physiological data alone rarely gives you the full story. For example, an increase in heart rate might indicate fear, but equally it could indicate excitement. That's why psychologists often combine physiological data with self-report data and behavioural data. It enables them to get a more in-depth insight into someone's psychological state. Some measures test what people can do rather than what they feel. Performance-based measures assess specific abilities such as reasoning or memory, for example by asking participants to complete pattern recognition puzzles within a strict time limit. A key strength of the performance-based approach lies in the concept of standardisation. These tests are administered and scored the same way for everyone. This allows psychologists to build up normative data, which are benchmarks that show what constitutes normal or even exceptional performance on a test within a given population. But performance-based measures often reflect the culture that they were created in, and this can disadvantage people from different backgrounds. Of course, any of the approaches we've just covered encompasses a range of tools. For example, for any given psychological construct such as well-being, there are usually a number of questionnaires available to measure it. This raises the important question of, well, how do we know if any measure we're thinking of using is any good? And that brings us on to two key concepts when it comes to judging any measure within psychology: reliability and validity. Reliability is essentially consistency. Does a measure give stable results under the same conditions? So if the same participant completed an anxiety questionnaire on multiple occasions under the same conditions and with without any intervention from the researchers, but achieve significantly different results each time, that would likely point to a problem with the reliability of that questionnaire. Checking the stability of a measure across time is called test-retest reliability. Of course, some constructs do fluctuate naturally across time, so what constitutes consistent rather depends on what's being measured. When a number of people are responsible for making a judgment, psychologists look for something called inter-rater reliability. Essentially, this asks the question, are the judgments of independent observers consistent? For example, if one experimenter judged a participant to be anxious and another experimenter judged the same participant in the same conditions to be calm, then it would be difficult to know what to make of that data. When we're dealing with questionnaires, an additional consideration is that of internal reliability, which concerns whether items that are supposed to measure the same psychological construct generate similar responses. This basically tells us if the questionnaire is conceptually coherent. Validity is, crudely speaking, accuracy. In other words, does a tool actually measure what it says it does? There are a number of different types of validity. Face validity refers to whether, at first glance, the contents of a measure seem relevant and appropriate to its intended purpose. A confidence scale featuring items about speaking up in a group has face validity. One that features items on musical preferences, not so much. Construct validity is about the extent to which a measure aligns with established theory on the construct being addressed. For example, confidence should correlate with related traits such as self-efficacy, but it shouldn't correlate with unrelated ones such as neuroticism. Criterion validity relates to the extent to which a measure predicts relevant outcomes. For example, confidence scores should predict someone's willingness to give a presentation. Last but most certainly not least, we have ecological validity, which relates to the extent to which a measure used in a study is representative of real-world behaviour. For example, being asked to recall details of an event we'd witnessed would be considered more ecologically valid than being asked to recall a random series of numbers and letters. A good measure in psychology is both reliable and valid, and yes, it can be difficult to achieve a balance between these two things. In fact, achieving a good balance between reliability and validity is one of the main challenges that psychologists face when they develop new measures. But there are a few other things that can also make measurement a bit tricky. Even with reliable and valid tools, measurement is not neutral. Culture, language, and context can all affect what a measurement means. A measure created in one culture can be skewed towards that culture's values. For example, an item in a questionnaire intended to measure happiness, such as "I feel proud of my achievements," might sit well with those in an individualist society, but might be at odds with those from a more collectivist culture, in which the concept of happiness might relate more closely to things like family harmony. Without careful cross-cultural validation, translation, and checking for equivalence, the same item can mean different things to people from different cultures. Even within a culture, responses can be distorted by expectation. For example, people might be inclined to respond to items within a questionnaire in a way that paints them in a good light at the expense of honesty, particularly if the topic addressed by that questionnaire might be seen as negative, such as aggression or prejudice. This is called the social desirability bias. Researchers try and control for this by emphasising the anonymous nature of responses to questionnaires, using indirect questions or social desirability scales. The phrasing of items within a measure also affects the responses they will likely receive. This is known as wording effects. For example, leading questions imply a correct answer. Ambiguously phrased questions cause confusion. Psychologists try and avoid these issues by pilot testing measures and also achieving a balance between positive and negatively worded items. Context also matters. For example, if you were conducting a study involving the measurement of perceived subjective well-being, and some of your participants filled out your questionnaire in a chaotic and loud environment, whereas others filled the questionnaire out in a calm and quiet lab, you would expect the differences in the environments that the questionnaires were administered in to confound the results. How we define and quantify constructs determines the questions we can ask, the patterns we can detect, and the conclusions we can draw. A flawed measure means flawed data. That's why psychologists spend a lot of time and effort carefully defining constructs, choosing the appropriate measures, standardizing procedures, and testing reliability and validity before drawing conclusions. In the next episode, we'll examine how psychologists use words as opposed to numbers to gain insights into the mind. If that's something you'd like to learn more about, then be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you in the next episode.